We will now move on to the forum and question answer side of things, where I hope to hear from the participants what they thought about the 3 or 4 talks that we had this afternoon. Did it really help you in better framing your understanding of maritime security? And also, there was a lot of emphasis on the geopolitical side of things. And as Andy mentioned earlier, he hoped that he has convinced you that really, in addition to non-traditional and ecological threats, the geopolitical and geostrategic side of things are as important as well. It'd be really interesting to hear how you felt about that. I will open the floor to any questions. And in the meantime, please feel free to leave your questions and your thoughts in the chat box, and we can definitely get the conversation going. So we've got some questions in the chat. And here it says, you spoke about the way in which maritime security issues are affected by issues on land. How do social attitudes, ideas, and ideologies, example, nationalism or attitudes to gender, affect maritime security? I think this is a really good question. And if you are in the crowd, feel free to unmute your mic. I think it'd be really great to hear from you if you want to expand on this.
What I meant was because you were talking about, I might as well speak. You were talking about how it's an extension of an issue that takes place on land. So, and we tend to talk about issues in terms of events and things like that. But I'm talking about, if you're thinking about the realm of ideas, then how does an ideology, which is a mental conception, affect what's taking place on a maritime level?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a brilliant question, and in fact, we're already seeing how this is being played out in our region. I think Dr. Tan would be able to expand more on how nationalism drives a certain angle towards a state's behavior at sea. But in terms of gender, I think a very good case in point is the Angels of the Sea, which is a term referred to a unique, special set of women Coast Guard forces that are known to be able to have deterred foreign vessels by just really using their broadcast speaker and encouraging these vessels to leave the area. And this is known to be successful because the role of a woman is thought to engender maternal instincts that would want to deter men from pushing their vessels further into traditional territorial waters. And so I think by looking at gender this way, it's really interesting how it has actually shaped a particular form of deterrence. Whether or not this particular force is successful would be another issue, but it has been known to apparently be able to deter, or vessels have known to have left that area when this force was in operation. So that is definitely a particular example of how attitudes to gender and how what role of women play in maritime law enforcement can affect a state's behavior at sea. Do we have any other questions? Oh, cool. So we've got Haris. Haris, if you want to speak, you can. Go ahead.
Hi, Doctor. Haris Mohammed here from Lishikini.
Hi.
Okay. Just curious because you mentioned about media coverage is important on maritime security, but I think all this while many times that when the media are reporting on maritime security, it always rely on the official version or because the media is not largely present, at the maritime side. So what do you think of this? Do you think that, especially at this side of the world, and now we have a very, volatile situation between China and United States, and things, I think that we need more media presence, to do first-hand observation rather than relying on official versions of what's happening and things like that. Thank you.
I think that's a very good point. I think Andy and I attended the Shangri-La Dialogue, and I do recall having a whole host of cameras and the whole media right behind me trying to capture the proceedings as they took place. So in some cases, I am aware that there is a media presence, but more often than not, there aren't. And this is definitely, I think, a gap which needs to be addressed. I feel that more transparency needs to take place across the region so we can better really understand the environment that we are operating in. But having said that, if we were to work with what we have now, I would encourage maybe the media to really look at the keywords that are being used and see where else they have appeared in official statements and in what context. I think it's important to maybe also go a step further and talk to experts on the ground who are very intimately tied to this, not just the foreign policy makers, but what we call the think tankers or the track two. These are people who are very closely linked to the policy world, but they're also a bit more confident to actually share their analysis and their opinions as well. So thanks very much for that question. So Andy, you talked about jargon, lexicons, and reading between the lines. How do changes in terminology and reporting affect how we can perceive maritime security? It's the particular set of terms that governments love using over others.
Yes. I would like to cite the example that I repeated in my presentation. When the three governments, Australia, Britain, and America, launched AUKUS, they kept insisting that the submarines are nuclear powered, are not nuclear armed. There is no way Australia will acquire a nuclear arm. So it's basically saying that, yes, submarines are a weapon, but at the same time, they are a weapon for a peaceful purposes, for a defensive purposes. We are not changing. It's not a game changer in the area. Other countries have also acquired nuclear-powered submarines. So is Australia. So it's a way of trying to preempt opposition from potential opposition from regional countries and to gain acceptance of Australia's legitimate intention to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. Another example is the way America promotes freedom of navigation. The term freedom itself connotes that it is what everybody wants. You want freedom of access to the South China Sea, which is important for international global shipping routes. So you should support us because we are defending freedom. We are maintaining freedom of access to this area, and any country that wants to impose exclusive control of that area should be opposed. You should join us, Americans, to oppose any attempts to make control of the sea exclusive. So there is a lot of so there is a lot of political packaging that comes into maritime security initiatives as they relate to military issues.
Thank you for that. I think it's important how you like how you ended your point on the way a particular strategy is packaged and framed with the right words.
Yeah, and I think it's also important this is where the critical role of journalists is try to unpack the hidden meaning of what is said and what is left unsaid in all these statements. Because military defense issues in maritime security, especially, they are laden with a lot of political agendas, as I said, with vested political interests. So it is imperative for journalists to unpack them and for the public to know what's the real intention behind these statements and policies.
Definitely. We've got another question from Haris from Malaysia Kini, where AUKUS is a symptom of an arms race that has already started. And can you give more examples of other symptoms which maybe media should be looking out for? How about ASEAN countries? So we're looking for indicators, Andy, of a potential arms race or response to it. What should we keep an eye out for?
As I explained in the presentation, one indicator, it's the theoretical explanation for an arms race is very strict. There should be an action-reaction cycle between two or more countries. There is a specific identification of who your enemy is and what kind of weapon your enemy is acquiring, and you are responding to that. A clear example of this is, of course, between America and Russia during the Cold War, when they are trying to outmatch one another in their weapon systems. America is buying missiles, buying combat planes, whereas and at the same time, Soviet Union is also trying to catch up in trying to developing maybe not the number, but more importantly, a more advanced type of combat aircraft than America. So that's happening. But arms race can also be asymmetrical. You don't have to, two countries don't have to compete with the same weapon systems. You can compete on the basis of countermeasure to a weapon. So for instance, when America has a leading edge in the number and sophistication of aircraft carriers. China is also trying to catch up with aircraft carriers, but not to the same extent. But at the same time, China is developing anti-aircraft carrier weapons. So basically missiles, hypersonic missiles that can target and again that can hit American aircraft carriers when these warships are closing into Chinese coastlines. So these things are happening, but again, all this reflects respective national geostrategies of countries. This is how countries trying to protect what they think is the legitimate idea of the maritime domain. For America, the legitimate idea is maintain access. Whatever China is doing in the South China Sea is illegitimate. China is opposed to it. On the other hand, is to the contrary. China wants to preserve its control. It wants to regulate who is coming and going through the portion of the sea that it claims as its own. So so I guess as journalists, and I think in the media, it's very important to cover both sides. What the two sides are trying to claim as rightfully theirs in their national geostrategies, and how these national strategies are implemented in defense and military terms.
Thank you so much, Andy. I think this has been a really good starter for us, primarily because, Andy, I think you highlighted the importance of us to really need to keep a lookout on how certain strategies or policies are framed and how it's being tied up in its political package. You have cautioned the journalists to look out for what is said and what is left unsaid as well, because policymakers have a tendency to carefully construct their words, their sentences, and to apply a very conscious use of particular terms. You mentioned freedom, for example. You mentioned nuclear powered, for example. So it's our role to try to figure out what the hidden meaning is behind the specific usage of these terms. In terms of really looking out for a future trend of geostrategy, you indicated that in addition to looking at emerging strategic arrangements such as AUKUS, we should also look at procurement patterns. How are the current assets that these states have, and the future procurement plans of these states? How will that determine geostrategy in the future, and also the types of foreign and defense policies that will be used by these competing states? But at the end of the day, I think you alluded that the base motivation for all competing parties will remain the same, despite the shifting in trends, the type of weapons and assets that we go out to purchase. And this is something that journalists will always need to go out and look for and constantly establish and reestablish what these motivations are, how are current procurement patterns reflecting them, and what can we expect in the near future. We have a question here submitted via Google form. Oh, that's nice. So the world is facing a sea pollution problem, and Indonesia is one of the largest plastic waste contributor in the world after China. If not taken seriously, marine pollution will impact not only on marine ecosystem and human health, but also tourism sector and the economy. So what have countries in ASEAN done to tackle the problem? And has this issue received enough attention from ASEAN countries? Perhaps we can move on to, maybe we can hear from Dr. Dudi on this, on what ASEAN's role has been. Dr. Tan and Andy, if you'd like to share your 2 cents, you can as well. Dr. Dudi, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ashura. And the question is very timely indeed, because I think plastic pollution or marine pollution is very concerning. And as the question mentioned, that it's making new problems in the ecosystem of the oceans. But in ASEAN, I think we can see it from 2 perspectives. If you want to see what ASEAN have done, I think the first one, we can see that ASEAN, I think in 2019, launched the so-called ASEAN Regional Action Plan for combating marine debris in ASEAN member states. So there is a regional plan of action which was made by the ASEAN states. I think during that time it was the Thailand who was the chair, and then initiated this program, and there's a plan of action. You can see that there are different steps that are being taken, the principles that wants to be upheld in the region regarding this. And secondly, more outward is we can see the East Asia Summit leader statement on combating marine plastic debris. I think there were several statements made on this one, I think in 2017, I think, and also on 2018. And then also there is also a plan to have a kind of plan of action in East Asia Summit level. But the only problem that East Asia Summit is not as comprehensive as ASEAN. ASEAN has different pillars. They have the political, and then they have the economic, and so on and so forth. But so to deal with this issue within ASEAN, I think it's more easier. And once we have this action plan, usually the countries tries to uphold the statements and also the aspirations by the different ASEAN member states. But in East Asia Summit is a different one, because East Asia Summit is not as compact, the organization. It's mostly is a meeting between either summit or also sometimes ministers level, but they do not have a working level kind of organization. But East Asia Summit have different kind of countries, of course, outside ASEAN, like Russia, also Korea, Japan, China, where we want them to also be involved in such measures. You know, like the mention about China, also a huge contributor to this pollution. Also other countries who can be like a funding country, like Japan, also Korea, or maybe India in this case. So what we need to do is to combine the two. We don't want to have one plan of action in ASEAN and then the other one in East Asia Summit, but does not correlate to each other. Maybe the one in ASEAN can be done first, because we already have the plan of action, and also we have the working group to do so, to check the reports, what countries have done during these years. But also during the bigger East Asia Summit can learn from what we have in regional, and also try to find ways how to also apply with other countries such as China, Japan, and India. I think those are my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Dudi. I think it's refreshing to see that ASEAN has already dedicated a working group to tackling marine debris. This was also reflected, as you said, in EAS. We've got plans of actions. We're holding states accountable, looking at annual reports. But how much of this is actually taking place on the ground? To what extent are countries really dedicating assets and planning their national strategies around marine pollution and plastic pollution, really upholding this as a key goal of ASEAN? I think I alluded earlier to agenda setting, and how policymakers really try contend with this complexity or competition in agendas and priorities. And is marine pollution really up there in terms of ASEAN, and even in terms of the priorities of our regional neighbors? This is a good question, because it also leads us to think, what more can we do to transform these working groups into more actionable outcome? Currently, from my perspective, I'm not seeing that, but it'd be really great to hear if you guys feel that you are seeing it as well.
Well, if I might add, I think in a similar fashion, marine plastic pollution dovetails with concerns about climate change, especially in Indonesia. All these island countries, archipelagic countries, that are quite vulnerable to the rise of sea levels. And I do agree with you, Ashura, that there is some sort of competition brewing, or if not, it's already underway, between states' capacity to pay attention, to heed to these non-traditional concerns, to more traditional ones. And it's and as Dr. Haido has explained, the greater the risk of interstate frictions in the South China Sea will sadly and unfortunately distract national attention of these countries to focus on the less traditional security concerns.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. That was a sobering reality that you brought to us.
we have to keep track with the reality.
Yeah. Do you have any comments?
I think also I'm quite pessimistic on that. I mean, as I agree with Andy and to other people. So when we have hierarchy of problems that in the region, so I think that the government pay more attention to the traditional security. We have a hierarchy of the problems in the South China Sea and elsewhere. So I think that the national security issue comes first, especially in the hard defense term. And of course, we see a lot of investment in the submarines and other things. It's not investment in tackling with the plastic and other things. And the second thing that we have the framework between ASEAN and EAS. But of course, as people mentioned, that how much action that we put on the ground. So I'm quite doubtful, because it is indeed into in the hand of the sovereign state. So I think it's very hard, because I think every country have the national program to reduce plastic. But do we really have some substitution for plastic? No. And I think the use of plastic already is also increased during the pandemic. So we go back to the food delivery, everything, and I see, the fight up every day in my house, everything is a plastic bag. And the plastic things. And because this will be more problematic in the future when we have entire mass disposal, mass everything, all the disposal things we have.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I think that we need to tackle these are always the people to tackle the hard security.
Yeah. I don't understand how so these are important issues, but I don't understand how governments can actually because it's a matter of lifestyle as well. So how the governments of each country can mobilize its population, to stop using plastic. I think this problem is more of a bottom up than a top down. The solution lies in a bottom up, not a top down solution. I mean, ASEAN governments, ASEAN countries can meet and talk, but only the people, have their final say whether they're going to stop using plastics or not. Because it's just very hard how a top-down solution to this marine pollution can be tackled.
Just to react a little bit, Ashura.
Go ahead.
Just to react to Andy and also to Dr. Do regarding these ASEAN measures. I think it is correct that the action plan is mainly putting the standard setting first, more to the implementation or applicability. So if we see that the content of the action plan is more to policy support and planning, so that's one pillar. And then research, innovation, and capacity building, that's another pillar. Private sector engagement, and also public awareness and education outreach. So if we see from these different pillars, we can already see what is the aim of having this action plan. It's more to community learning, giving the information regarding this, awareness building, and so on and so forth. And maybe, hopefully, the next step, as Andy and also Dr. Do mentioned, that this could be implemented bottom up. But hopefully, Dr. Do won't be that pessimistic again in the coming years. We have to be optimistic, because we should start from the action plan. Then only we'll have something more concrete on the ground. Thank you.
Definitely. I think ASEAN is provides the standards. It's up to the country's political willingness. Okay, I'm sure everyone saw the kind reminder from Adip in the chat that we do need to look at the other questions, everyone. So I'm going to open the floor to Carmela Fonbuena. If you're there, do you want to elaborate a bit more on your questions? Carmela is asking on arms race.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Carmela of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. Thank you for organizing this masterclass. As I told Danny, obviously in the Philippines, there's a lot of opinions about maritime security, and there's also a lot of noise. But it's good to hear what other countries think also about the situation. So my question, which Dr. Tan has addressed in part, is what do the other speakers think about the Thucydides trap, the inevitability of armed conflict, the supposed inevitability of conflict between the US and China? But more importantly, my question is, how do we avoid that trap? Thank you.
Thanks for that. Andy, this is your question.
Okay. So if I get this right, Thucydides trap means I have a copy of a history of the Peloponnesian War, in which Graham Allison quoted that term, made that term. I think the trap means, a rising great power will make the existing great power insecure. So war is inevitable between them. I think when we reflect on the situation between China and United States, oftentimes we hear people say there is misunderstanding, there is miscommunication. I think we have to make it very clear. In order to solve a problem, you have to admit there is a problem. I think there is no misunderstanding as such. There is a full frontal confrontation and collision between the two. America will not let China retake Taiwan. America will not let China control the South China Sea in the way that China wishes to. Nor will China tolerate America to keep supporting Taiwan, supporting countries in the South China Sea that are in disagreements with China over claims in the South China Sea. So there is a full-on frontal collision. The question is, to what extent this collision does not degenerate into a full-scale war? And I think this is where the operational matters come into the picture. I think there should be a lot more, not just confidence-building measures, because that have been done for decades. And I think the regional countries, and especially ASEAN, should take a step up and try to ask the hard questions. How can we engage in less confidence, not less as in terms of less activities? Certainly CBMs are important, but they should broaden their scope into, say, crisis management mechanisms, dispute settlement mechanisms. How, I explained about the rising acquisitions of submarines, increasing acquisition of submarines. So there will be a lot of submarines in the water. And as Haido has mentioned, there is an increased risk of submarine collisions. So what can ASEAN countries do in order to minimize this? For instance, there should be a transparency, a water space management. Countries should declare their submarine primary area of operations, for instance. So A lot of crisis management mechanisms are available out there, hotlines between naval and coast guard chiefs between countries. Code for unplanned encounters at sea, how two law enforcement ships or navy ships can avoid collisions during when they were performing their patrol duties. So these are the options that the countries should look at, and I think there is a greater chance to alleviate concerns of miscommunications at the operational level rather than at the strategic and political level. For the strategic and political levels, I'm sorry to say there is no misunderstanding. This is a full-on head-on collision of clash of interest between America and China. That said, I don't think war is inevitable. I think America and China still has interest. Still has shared interests. Economics is the fundamental part, but as history suggests, two countries which are interdependent in economy did start a war. Germany and UK were interdependent economically in the early 20th century, but still they went to war. America was Japan's largest export market in the 1930s. They went to war. So economic interdependence in and of itself is not guaranteed that two countries cannot start a war.
Thanks, Andy. You know how they say, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. So that means that. You mentioned employing rules of engagement as a potential crisis management mechanism. You mentioned cues, for example, but I want to actually look at the legal aspect to this. Legally, Dr. Dudi, do you think what kind of legal mechanisms can we resort to? Is there really a positive outcome in the current processes that ASEAN is participating in it's really trying to help the region avoid this growing conflict between the US and China?
I think it is clear that this should be looked into through international relations angle, because I think from the three anatomy of conflict that I mentioned, this is more to the regional stability. And if we want to talk about the territorial entitlements or the maritime rights or maritime zone, it's quite clear. The law is there. The law mentioning how a state can be the owners of islands, reef, or rocks, or any other maritime features in the area is quite clear. And once you have the owners, then it's going to be very easy for you to determine how long, how far is the maritime zones that they have. But talking about the US and China rivalry, I think it's quite clear that US is against aggressive actions of China in the area. So that's why they do the FONOPs. And then China, on the other hand, thinks that this US US FONOPs or their presence creates instability. And thus, this is the hegemony. There's the two powers, and also, the best way to deal with this is international law. If the US is doing FONOPs based on UNCLOS, then they can do so, but they don't do also, like, at the same time, let's say, seismic survey or any kind of surveillance, which also is against international law. And on the other hand, China, if they think that they want to claim that area, then they need to know how far they can limit their activity there, creating military bases and so on and so forth. It's not part of the problem here. And we can see also from public narratives here, US tries to support ASEAN's claim against China, saying that we can sail, fly, operate wherever international law allows. So in this case, it looks that the US is actually giving a side to ASEAN. But on the other way, China thinks that the US and Australia is not neutral anymore. Why do they come in an area where they are far away from? And this a conflict between countries should be done between them, not with external power. So ASEAN, who is actually in the middle, think that okay, we welcome anyone who supports UNCLOS, but we are against any power projection based on rivalry. So this is clear. ASEAN states are very fond of UNCLOS. We support UNCLOS fully, but once US or any other countries comes into picture and tries to, let's say, help us in terms of arguments, but this is because they want to have a power projection based on rivalries here, so we have to say no to that. That's why Andy also mentioned about how AUKUS was, actually by Malaysia and Indonesia, we were not, liking this idea that much, even though we didn't mention AUKUS literally in the statement. So this is how we deal with the problem. We want to be friends with everyone, and also just making sure that the regional stability also maintained. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dudi. I think this is what you're saying. It really reflects what we've been highlighting so far, really maintaining this fine balance in crisis management. I think Carmela has something to add on Taiwan. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to. I think there's long been an agreement that obviously legal frameworks need to be in place, and that's the ideal way of resolving the conflicts. But there are also a lot of impatience, obviously, in the sense that these frameworks take too long, and sometimes the institutions, even the ASEAN institutions, they're not felt or they're not actionable. In the context of Taiwan, for example, we've seen what happened to Hong Kong. And I remember a security expert saying, let's watch what China does to Hong Kong. And we've seen what it did in Hong Kong. So given the current discourse on Taiwan now, we've seen Xi Jinping issue a statement on Taiwan again. What are the prospects given the current situation?
Thank you, Carmela. I'm going to push this to Dr. Tan because we've not heard from him in the last round. Would you like to comment?
Yep. So, I think it's very important questions that we need to ask ourselves. Yeah, so whether the possibility of the conflict between the two major powers that already happened, in the World War I and World War II. But I think the logic is that if you want peace, so you have to prepare for wars. So I'm more the hardcore realist and Andy a bit. So I don't believe in economic independence and also the mechanisms. So that's the reason why I think that the logic behind the AUKUS that provide Australian with the nuclear power submarines in a way that it could create the deterrence. And I think that it anyway it will be the issue, the problem in the region, that if you want to live in peace but you have no arms, you will lose something. I mean, the Philippines learned the way very hard with the Scarborough Shoal, and I think that if you leave it open, and also it will invite the aggressions. I mean, dovish attempt is nice, but it cannot prevent it, from that not make other people also treating you the same. So I think that the logic of international relations that will prompt, the reactive behavior, and I think that China is also smart. They know, they know that there will be the response, so that they try to work on with the gray zone operations, because they have the military strength, but they don't use that. They use a civilian power, so that to expand the influence in the South China Sea. But it do it to the extent that other country really worried. I mean, so that even during the pandemic, China expansions on in every direction that caused the country, and that triggered, the whole change of alignments and realignments. And I think that that unfortunately that something had been activated, and that one we will live in the uncertain area for a very long time. And of course, in that uncertain areas, everyone will be defensive, and everyone will be will do the self-help. They have the self-help option, so that they would prevent themselves from any type of contingency that will happen to them.
Thank you, Dr. Tan.
Can I jump in?
Yeah. What do you
Yes.
think of the Taiwan situation as well? If you could comment on that, that'd be great. Andy, go ahead.
Hello. Oh yes. Okay. So yeah. Adding to what Haido has said, I think we have to look in the historical context of what's happening in the Taiwan Strait. The current tensions, cross-strait tensions, are not the first time, nor are they going to be the last. And in the past, we have witnessed similar posturing, similar tit-for-tat reactions. Remember, in 1996, there was a Taiwan Missile Strait crisis, and actually, there was a lot more posturing involved there. America sent two two aircraft carrier strike groups to deter China from invading Taiwan, and I think a lot of this posturing is directly related to what's happening within Taiwan. If we remember, in '96, there was also a pro-independent president, Chen Shui-bian, if I'm not mistaken, his name. And I think the current government who's ruling in Taiwan also tinkers with the idea of pro-independence. So I think China is demonstrating political signal, sending strategic signal to America. Rain down this government, tone down its voices, pro-independent voices. And unfortunately, we are going to see similar kind of military posturing activities to occur in the future. And hence, this is what I'm why I stress about the operational deconflicting measures that countries should adhere to. And I think ASEAN can play a leading role in this. But at the same time, ASEAN can only do so much. Look at the legally binding code of conduct, on the South China Sea. How long has it been dragging on? And ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. To what extent has it addressed some of these operational concerns? And to my knowledge, comparing ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific with the recently released European Union Indo-Pacific strategy, they are quite, very different documents. And it is European Union, not ASEAN, that stresses explicitly the need for a legally binding code of conduct. I don't understand why there is no specific mention, specific sentences, statements that prescribe, that restrict provocative military posturing. That countries should not take. And there is a lot of opportunity in this area, but the question is whether ASEAN has the capacity to venture into this layer. Yeah.
Thanks, Andy. We'll move to Dr. Dudi for a quick response to Andy's comment on ASEAN, and then we will have to try wrap up very quickly with one last question. So go ahead, Dr. Dudi.
I think I just want to point out about the COC negotiations. I think that's taking quite a long time, but because it's very sensitive, I think the problem is quite clear, is how to define the geographical scope of the South China Sea itself. So from there is, I think, it's going to be very hard to determine which belongs to where and how we want to define the area. And also, secondly, we want to know that whether the COC is a legally binding document or it's going to be only morally binding document. That's also another view that people think that it's not going to be easy, because if it's legally binding, then is China going to be bound by this agreement, or also other ASEAN countries are willing to be, following this agreement for the future? So those are the things. And regarding ASEAN, to see the stability in the region, I think ASEAN is quite clear about the non-interference principle. So basically, even though they are playing the role of stabilizing the region, trying to keep everything toned down and pulled down, but also the principles that they have, not to be interfering with other domestic affairs, also is also one of the principles that's upheld by the states in ASEAN. So it's a mixed puzzle. but I think there is a way to deal with it. That's why we have negotiations. That's why we have diplomacy. That's why we have ASEAN partners and so on and so forth. So hopefully by having these dialogues, continuous discussions, just like what we have today, this will increase the confidence building and also the trust deficit that maybe many countries have. We can also decrease it from time to time. Those are my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Dudi. I think just to really sum up, I don't know what we've been observing so far in this discussion is that yes, the negotiation of CC is taking a long time, and to what extent really does it have real value in resolving our competing claims? Nevertheless, ASEAN does play a role in maintaining this momentum in keeping negotiations ongoing. But while that is happening, we've got the reality of the developing incidents and strategic arrangements that are taking place in South China Sea. And this is really here where Dr. Tan comes in with his realpolitik statement that, if you need to defend, you defend. And Andy is saying that in the meantime, let's try hold the fort down by engaging in rules of engagement behavior. Let's look at cues. Let's look at crisis management resolutions. So I think what's happening now is really the best case scenario. So as much as we can, we are trying very hard to try temper the tone, and hopefully this resolution in resolving U.S.-China won't happen soon. Okay, Dr. Tan, go ahead.
No, my point is that you should not be afraid of that. U.S. and China will fight each other, and they won't fight each other because they all have nuclear weapons. The only thing I worry about the proxy wars, because it's always happened in the past between the two superpower, and of course that will be definitely in the periphery areas of the major powers. And that thing that we have to think about that. And of course, I think that it's better to have also the collective voices against any type of attempts that will definitely just think of South China Sea make us have to be worried, because if we stay silent, if we behave nice, it doesn't mean that you are safe from the aggression. So I think what happened over the last decade, I see that diplomacy, I think appeasement doesn't work. So I mean that that's time that if you don't stand up to defend what is right or what is wrong, and what you make your voice up again and kind of unlawful claims and actions, that one day that will happen to you. So we all learned that very hard lesson in the South China Sea. And I think that of course some ASEAN should learn it, because it's their affairs. For some countries, take a free ride from that, and we also understand. So we be better to have more mechanism to cope with that issue rather than to leave it to ASEAN. And I think that ASEAN is not fit to that type of issue at hand.
I agree with Haido, and especially on the point, your point about proxy wars, and what we are seeing in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, in the Middle East. There will be more such wars happening, and I think it's the challenge is greater for ASEAN to manage. Look at what's happening in Myanmar right now. It's unrelated to the South China Sea, but it is a very contentious issue at the moment. How ASEAN can make sure the regime in power adhere to the 5-point consensus. And Singapore Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan already said that Myanmar regime ignored 5-point consensus. So what else can ASEAN do?
Thanks, Andy. Okay, so clearly there are limitations in the way ASEAN is functioning. So we can only hope for the best. What I'll do now is I'm going to scroll up the chat box a bit, and we've got 2 questions that are both related to China's developing infrastructure and also the Belt and Road Initiative. So perhaps I can just kind of go around. This will be our last question, just to kind of go around and get like a 2-minute reflection on the Belt and Road Initiative that China is running across Southeast Asia. What are its impacts on maritime security? And also in relation to this, the building of infrastructure across sea lines of communication. This is closely linked to the finance projects and the loan relationship that China has with its neighbors, but also the claimant states. So what are your views on that, BRI and China infrastructure building, and the loans with claimant states to support development in the region. We'll start with Dr. Dudi, and I will hear from Andy and Dr. Tan. Also, perhaps after you give your 2-minute reflection, if you could share any closing statements or main takeaway points to the journalists in the room, that would be extremely helpful as well. Over to you, Dr. Dudi.
Yes, thank you. So I will deal with the second question first. So I think even though China is building up many infrastructures in the region, including in some of the sea lanes and so on and so forth, it doesn't change the law. Because if you want to know how a maritime feature could be a part of a state, there is a law on top of that. So like we gain uti possidetis juris, let's say from our successor state, and then we will have the area that we are having today. So this one is different. It's inhabited, but still there is a law how to regulate the ownership of those. So it doesn't mean that if you are trying to build anything on top and then it becomes yours. Also, there is, I would also like to inform about a new legal regime that's trying to be developed by China, which is called the hybrid island. Maybe Dr. Do already heard about this. So basically, in UNCLOS, it's clear that if there is a place where you can live, there is human habitation, that it can sustain human habitation, then that area could be stated as an island. The consequences of an area becoming an island is that you can have 200 nautical miles of economic exclusive zone, because that's what the UNCLOS said. But UNCLOS never mentioned about a natural feature, and then you build on top of that natural feature, becoming an island that can sustain human habitation. So they try to fill in that gap by saying that this is the natural habitat, and this is formed from natural, which is what UNCLOS wanted. And then now we have an island which can sustain human habitation, so it becomes an island. So they call this as a hybrid island. But this kind of thinking is not yet accepted, because it's unclear whether the UNCLOS actually regulate about this. And also, there is no agreement between the international community, also via the United Nations, regarding the terminology of hybrid island, the concept, and so on and so forth. So it's still a problem. So after we have the arbitral tribunal in 2016, it's all clear that none of the features in the South China Sea is entitled to 200 nautical miles, which means that it is considered as what it was, whether it is reef, whether it is shoal, whether it is rocks, and it only allows them to have 200 nautical miles. I think for BRI, I will pass it to the other speakers, but for a small part of it, I think China tries to engage with as many countries as they could to have an agreement with the China related to BRI, because I think from historic point of view, that they think this is like also their trade route previously, and they want to make sure that this could still sustain, and they want to make a big impact here. And also BRI also relates to their claims to the 9-dash line, so it's also very hard for the Southeast Asian countries to accept. Again, you can only claim on ownership over islands or any maritime feature is based on the legal basis. You cannot do that based on historic rights, because historic rights does not have basis. Or maybe one question that we can question to China. When the discussion of UNCLOS 1982, Indonesia, before that, during that time, we were made of so many islands, and we have waters in between our islands, and we think that water actually divides our islands. But the thinking of the Indonesian government during that time is no, the water which lies within the Indonesian islands is actually the glue. to the other islands. So that's why we can, if you remember the so-called Juanda Declaration, and this is actually a unilateral claim that we had before. We made a domestic law on this, and then we bring this to the UNCLOS negotiations. And after that, with take and give, package deal, and so on and so forth, the UNCLOS have a provision on the so-called archipelagic state. So if the Chinese government, since the beginning, thought that this is the design that they wanted, why don't they bring this idea of the 9 dotted lines, 9 dash line to the UNCLOS discussion and make it legal? So the fact that after 1982 entered into force in 1996, we don't have that issue raised. And you know that China is not only a signatory, but also they have ratified the UNCLOS. So this makes another question, whether this design is new or they try to have this historical background to make their new arguments to have the entire area and so on and so forth. So, and where was China during the 1982 discussion of UNCLOS? So again, this kind of questions you can always raise. So BRI could be very important, but most importantly is to have the legal basis to all the claims that you want to have, including the South China Sea. Thank you, Dr. Ashira.
Thank you. Very well laid out argument, Dr. Dudi. Do you have any closing statements before I move to Andy?
I think the last thing that I want to mention is that we need to keep on believing on ASEAN. I think we need to have a central role, as I mentioned before, in ASEAN. Maybe ASEAN is not yet as advanced as EU or any other regional groupings, but at least this is one of the means to maintain regional peace and stability. And in terms of South China Sea, I think I still have a big hope on the COC because this is the only main forum that ASEAN countries is sitting with China talking about what we can do on the ground. Maybe queues, call rights, and all these provisions can be part of COC. But again, geographical scope and also whether the document should be binding or morally binding is again another question. So I think we need to keep our hopes high. And I think even though, this is this case will be done maybe years after years, we don't know whether it's going to be done or not. Or maybe after, like Andy said, there will be a war first, then only there will be a solution to this. But I think because we have high hopes in Dr. Do with his publications and so on and so forth, I think we will have a solution in the future to get rid of the problem. I think those are my closing statements. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dudi. Thanks for ending on a positive note. ASEAN really is the only mechanism or infrastructure uniting all 10 member states and also the claimant states. So really, realistically speaking, that is our only hope for eventually reaching a resolution to these overlapping disputes. So thank you for that. Andy, over to you. If you want to reflect a bit on the BRI and
yes,
also any
certainly. Belt and Road Initiative. I think to the extent that maritime security matters is China's initiative on the part of the Maritime Silk Road, that is to help regional countries, other countries improve their port and shipping industries infrastructure. But I see China in promoting BRI, China is not engaging in charity. So it is an economic initiative with political ends. And it's not just China, any international economic initiative, especially for journalists, you have to be mindful of the vested political interests in such initiative. And I think, from a geostrategic lens, the way China has been handing out BRI is it is consistent with its effort to assert greater control of its maritime domain in the South China Sea and beyond. And as China's economy is increasingly reliant on the shipping routes, international shipping routes that I explained, so China's attempt to maintain security of these roads will also increase. And China has no trust whatsoever in the United States securing these shipping routes, because the more China is reliant on U.S. Navy or other countries' navies for the security of these locks, the more vulnerable China is to maritime blockade or other forms of geopolitical harassment that that I think that Ashura also mentioned, a blockade. So the question is, to what extent do countries, the recipient of BRI initiative, welcome China's effort? I think on the one hand, they should see, not see it, to ascertain China to keep such initiative strictly economic, business as business. Don't conflate it with political. So on the one hand, they can accept all this assistance, they can receive all this economic largesse. On the other hand, they should be very clear from the very beginning that they will retain their political independence as and when they are receiving this economic assistance. And this is the kind of what do you call it, situation that some countries, some recipient countries of BRI have failed. Hence, we heard the expression that trap diplomacy, because countries that receive this initiative, they have no capacity to repay that debt, and as a result, they have to compromise their political independence, to China. And I think the more countries who are engaged in this initiatives becoming more vulnerable to China, becoming more dependent on China. So at the same time, we'll see potential militarization or semi-militarization of the ports and infrastructure that China are building in order to sustain China's own maritime power projection, not just in the South China Sea, but beyond, like the Indian Ocean, for instance. Yeah.
Sandy, do you want to end on anything?
Yeah. I think I end up with my geostrategic analysis of these issues. I think I agree with Dudi that ASEAN is very important, and to be honest, there is no other regional vehicle that can accommodate all this divergent interests and even colliding interests, right? But at the same time, we have to be mindful of the asymmetric balance of power that is going on, and how ASEAN can also accommodate, not oppose initiatives that they are trying to return the balance of power into a new form of equilibrium. So yes, power politics is disdained, power politics is despised, but at the same time, history suggests that history is full of power politics. You cannot, instead of living in defiance of it, you have to live with it. Yeah.
Thank you, Andy. It's a good note to end on. And I think also your explanation of how BRI is very closely linked to China's power projection really echoes our earlier discussion on whatever happens on land is definitely extended on sea. And things that we see on sea is really a symptom of greater problems that are taking place between countries. The case in mind, which I thought I should share, is that in Brunei, for example, China has just signed a deal to run the Muara Fish Landing Complex, which is a fisheries port in Brunei. This is clearly, as you mentioned, an economic initiative. But at the same time, it's easier said than done to remind countries to retain their political independence, especially when initiatives such as this really grants this particular private company from China with fishing rights to over 2,000 hectares in Brunei's maritime zone. So really, to what extent and how should claimant states balance its need for more strategic autonomy together with the greater desire to offset any economic recession that it may face, and the need to really improve its economy, especially for smaller claimant states like Brunei. Another claimant state we have is Dr. Tan, who please, Dr. Tan, if you'd like to respond to the BRI question, and then you could end with some of your final concluding thoughts.
Yes, I think that the BRI will have multiple implications for the region. And on the one side, that it could be um, an additional source of funding for infrastructure development for many countries in the region, including Indonesia and also other countries, and that will be interested. Um, but also in the same time that if they are not managed properly, it will become a source of liabilities, especially because I don't worry much about the legal aspect that you so raise. I think that yeah, I mean most of the people would agree on that. But I think that there's two other implications that would be more complicated. First one is it build up the capacity for China. Of course, for the first thing is it defend the sea line of communication for itself. But of course, when China can secure the sea line communication, they are not dependent on others actors. So that would it may have the incentive, to act assertively and aggressively elsewhere because now there no ties exist. And the second one is a dependency that other countries, especially the small countries, small economies like Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, also Brunei, other countries would be dependent on that, so that it could lead to some kind of client state that for political purposes that we already mentioned. So I think that we have to look on that, but because it's very difficult to. I would say that though I support the idea, but it's very difficult to separate between economic and also political purposes for each of any investment project. So we live with that. So I think that it's better for every one country to build up their capacity and capability on that to work on. And finally, what I would like to the final message. I think that media play a very important role in the maritime security. I agree with Dr. Surya that it's affect everyone, but just that we don't know. So by bringing different aspects of maritime security from traditional one to non-traditional one, from fish stock to environment to sea level to plastic waste to piracy, and then to the possibility, the concerns about the conflict in the region, the arms race and other things that will make the public understand the natures of the issue. And also if we have the public awareness on that issue, so we can work on that. Otherwise, if we leave it for only government. So there are many ways that we see appeasement, and also somehow that we see that quiet diplomacy also inviting more greater assertiveness and aggressiveness. By on that, by building up the public awareness on that, we also create different pressure for other countries to comply with international law. Or otherwise, if the UNCLOS system will be collapsed, that will be a disaster for, because it's not only for Southeast Asian country, for other coastal states, also for China, US as well. So that would be fundamentally bad for all. So I think that that one is more people should be involved, and also that's the reason why I emphasize. Also, I accept the invitation to be part of the class, because I think that the public awareness is very important in the fight.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tan. I think as we reach the end of our masterclass, some key points that we need to remember as we embark on these stories that we hope to do, that the journalists hope to do on maritime security, is that the environment that maritime security takes place in is extremely complex, but is also characterized by this underlying asymmetric balance of power, as Andy pointed out. But at the same time, because of this, we have infrastructure such as ASEAN that is trying its very best to rise above this to maintain regional unity and keep the momentum going in trying to seek a resolution to threats that we see out there, including issues such as marine debris, while also tackling overlapping claims. But we do recognize that there are actors out there beyond ASEAN, beyond the Navy, beyond the Coast Guard, beyond the maritime militia, actors such as coastal communities, such as NGOs, that really need the agency and more capacity to do more for the sea and our maritime backyard. While all this is happening, we have to continuously address ecological threats. We are, at the end of the day, a maritime region. And so what needs to be done here is to really raise public awareness. In the meantime, as we move forward and band forward together, we should continue looking inward to build our own capacity so we can try and continue as much as possible to maintain that level of independence as we work and cooperate with our extra-regional powers and other neighbors. At the same time, let's strengthen regional collaboration and continue to uphold international law. I'd like to very much apologize for going beyond the stated time. We are 24 minutes past 6 p.m. But I would very much like to thank our brilliant guest speakers in the conversation that we had with Dr. Dudi, Andy, and also Dr. Tan. And also big thank you to Danny and also Adit from Kini Academy for allowing me to moderate this wonderful session and for actually enjoying my Saturday afternoon. So thank you very much, everyone.